to have with us two truly world-famous scholars of early Christianity. We have with us Dr. Robert Louis Wilken. Dr. Wilken is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of the History of Christianity at the University of Virginia. For those of us here, he was the Dr. Father for Brian Litvin, who teaches in Chicago. So, yay, University of Virginia. He is the author of many books, including The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, 1984, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, Seeking the Face of God, 2003, and our class textbook, The First 1,000 Years, A Global History of Christianity from Yale University Press in 2012. Dr. Wilken, we're extremely grateful that you'd share your morning with us today.
Thank you.
And we're also very privileged to have with us from Atlanta, Georgia, attending the ETS conference, but usually in Hong Kong, Professor Glen Thompson. Dr. Thompson served as professor of history for 10 years, from 2002 to 2012, as professor of history at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and currently serves as professor of New Testament and historical theology at Asia Lutheran Seminary in Hong Kong. Professor Thompson is the creator of the website www.fourthcentury.com, which is a marvelous resource, internet resource for the study of early Christianity. Gentlemen, we're extremely grateful to have you.
Our pleasure.
If I may ask Dr. Wilken just a couple questions as we begin concerning the textbook that we've had here. Dr. Wilken, your book, The First 1,000 Years, a global history of Christianity, is one of the first in a growing list of histories of Christianity that attempts to tell the Christian story from a global point of view. You relate the happenings of the church not only in the European context, but also in the context of Ethiopia, Armenia, Georgia, China, India, and in the Slavic countries. How do we read church history differently when we read it from this global point of view?
All right. Let me read the first couple of sentences of the introduction. What power preserved what once was? Now I'm getting an echo. Am I supposed to get an echo?
No, sir. Is it because of the earbuds?
I don't have earbuds.
Okay.
Can we try it again? Now I can't hear you.
Okay, so is the echo gone now, sir?
Well, let me try. Sounds like it's gone. All right, so the first sentence in the introduction. What power preserves what once was if memory does not last? These words from the Lithuanian poet Czesław Miłosz kept coming to mind as I was writing this book. The past doesn't vanish at once. It dies slowly. But if remembered, the dead maintain their ground and live among us. So in answer to your question, what we remember from the past determines what kind of people we are. Just as each of us in our individual lives, the things that have happened to us, the experiences that we have had, the things that we have read, make us a certain kind of person. And up until relatively recently, the history of Christianity told a story something like this. Christianity begins in Jerusalem. It moves from Jerusalem into the cities of the Roman Empire to the west of Jerusalem. That means Asia Minor, Greece, Rome, and then from Rome to places in northern Europe. When you think of the journeys of St. Paul, when You probably all have Bibles that have maps in the back of the journeys of St. Paul. They are all heading west into the Roman Empire. And so the story goes that Christianity was established basically around the Mediterranean Sea in the Roman Empire. And from there it spread north into Northern Europe. And Northern Europe then constituted a distinctive form of Christianity, Latin-speaking Christianity, Western Christianity. And out of that came the Middle Ages. And out of the Middle Ages came the Reformation. And from the Reformation, then you move on into modern Christianity. That's the story as it's been told. But what it overlooks is that Christianity also spread east. And once one begins to look at the spread of Christianity to the east, you begin to understand yourself as a Christian in a quite different way. You realize, first of all, that Christianity is not a Western religion. It's an Eastern religion. It's a Middle Eastern religion. You begin to realize that the Latin culture, which shaped Europe, and then the Reformation, and then modern Christianity, is only one form of Christianity. That there were other forms that were very distinctive. And so as one gets to know this history, you begin, first of all, to think differently about yourself. And secondly, then you begin to think differently about those Christians around the world who have come into the Christian church in the last 100, 200 years, who speak different languages, have different cultural habits, and they are as very much authentic Christians as those of us in the West. In other words, that the West cannot determine how Christians are to live out their lives in other parts of the world. It never was the case, and today we realize from first-hand experience that it's not the case.
Dr. Wilken, thank you for that. The history of Christianity.
Just lost you.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for the feedback, sir. The story of Christianity has been, historians for maybe about 10 years have begun to start telling the story of church history from this global point of view, but voices have been very few. When we think of church history, we still usually think of the cathedrals of France rather than the monasteries of Iraq. What are some of the initial stories that convinced you that there was more to be discovered here, that this story of Christianity had to be told from a global point of view?
Well, I don't know, 20 or 25 years ago, I went to Jerusalem for a conference on Christianity in the Holy Land. And the organizers of that conference had arranged for a series of learned papers, scholarly papers, on the various Christian groups within the Holy Land. The Lutherans, the Catholics, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Russians, there's a Russian Orthodox cathedral there, and even the Ethiopians. If you ever go to Jerusalem, the Ethiopians have a monastery on top of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the extraordinary place. And the Armenians, if you study the modern Jerusalem, history of Jerusalem, you realize that there is a Christian quarter, there's a Jewish quarter, there's a Muslim quarter, and there's an Armenian quarter. But this conference said nothing about the Arab-speaking Christians who actually live there and have lived there for centuries and are indigenous. And there was a man by the name of Samir, he was an Egyptian, and he had made it his life's goal to try to acquaint people with Arabic-speaking Christianity. Who had ever thought about Arabic-speaking Christianity? I hadn't thought very much about it at the time. And he gave us really a kind of an exhortation to say, here you have this thing, and you're not thinking about the people who actually made Christianity in this land. So what happened then, the indigenous Christians, I began to get interested in the history of Christianity in the Holy Land, and I wrote a book called The Land Called Holy. Well, what that forced me to do was to learn Arabic. Arabic's a tough language. I studied many other languages. I gave it 3 years, enough to read some text, but not really to do much more than that. And the more I studied Arabic Christianity, Arabic-speaking Christianity, the more I was drawn toward Iraq and Iran and places east, because Arabic and Syriac were the languages of the people, the Christians of this part of the world. And so it was really like so many things in life. You have an experience, you meet a person, it opens your eyes, you begin to look into it, and all of a sudden it begins to change how you do things. And so that gave me a perspective that I could look at the history of Western Christianity from a new vantage point.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Wilken, the Church of the East seems to be at the center of the Christian advance into the Middle East, also India, and even China. First of all, would you agree? And then also, what secondary sources or translations of primary sources would you recommend for those interested in studying the Church of the East?
Learn Syriac. People who want to study Christian history, early Christian history, understand that the big languages are Greek and Latin. But the third Christian language is Syriac. And over the last generation or so, there's been an enormous effort to translate Syriac Christian writings into English. And you can find many of these. One of the best translators is a man named Sebastian Brock. I have a number of his volumes here on my shelf. But perhaps the best answer to your question is in my bibliography. And I looked at that this morning, and there is a book here. It's called Christians in Asia Before 1500. Christians in Asia Before 1500, edited by Ian Gilman and Hans Joachim Klimkeit, University of Michigan Press, 1999. And I think that's about as good a place as any to begin. Some of the material that I have on the Church of the East comes from there. They've translated some smaller passages, and you can get, I think, a good feel of things. But the truth is that for the non-specialist, the study of Eastern Christianity is a challenge. It's an adventure, because you have to pick here and pick there, and it's very hard. There is no general coherent account. One other book to mention, which is also in this in the bibliography, it's by Sidney Griffith. Sidney Griffith is the premier American scholar of Syriac and Arabic-speaking Christianity. And if you go to his book, In the Shadow of the Mosque, you'll find a nice account of Syriac-speaking Christianity and Arabic-speaking Christianity. And then he's got another volume with a lot of essays in which he translates Arabic texts and Syriac texts. So those are some places you can start, but it's an adventure to try to get a kind of overall view of the Church of the East, and especially when you go further east. I give some in here, but it only is part, and it's partly to do with the limitation of our sources, or at least our translation of sources.
Good. Very good. Thank you for that response. Dr. Wilken, your book documents the importance of the rise of Islam for the developing shape of Christianity. How does the Christianity of the late antique and early medieval period reflect the influence of Islam?
Well, Islam forces Christianity to go into decline. So, let us suppose you go to Tunisia. Tunisia is a place that's very easy to visit. Tunisia was, of course, a Latin Christian world, because Christianity had come there from Rome, and that was, of course, where some of the great teachers, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, lived. And Christianity there was vibrant until about the year 500, till about the time of Augustine's death, which was in 430, though it continued on afterward. But with the rise and spread of Islam all across North Africa, that means Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and then finally it crosses the Straits of Gibraltar and goes into Spain, was basically wiped out. So if you go to church, if you want to go to church on a Sunday morning in Tunisia, what you're going to have to go to is a church which was established by French Christians in the 19th century. There is no indigenous Christianity in Tunisia. The same thing applies to Asia Minor, which of course is now Turkey. Turkey was Christian from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Aegean to present-day Armenia. It was the center of Greek-speaking Christianity. Some of the greatest teachers, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil, Gregory Nazianzus, came there, were bishops in there. That was all wiped out by the spread, not of Arabic Islam, but of Turkish Islam. So you go to Christianity today, to Turkey today, and there are no indigenous Christians. And of course now, what's happening in the Middle East, in Iraq especially, and Syria, in your lifetime there will be few Christians living in the Middle East. So what that means is that huge geographical areas that were once solidly Christian, Christianity now is simply a historical fact from centuries and centuries ago. So that's one point. Just the sheer disappearance of Christianity in all the lands. What it means is that we would be quite different Christians today had we had vibrant Christian communities in Asia Minor, in the Middle East, and in North Africa and Egypt that were still there, and these were Christian countries. Second thing is, which is a little bit even more disturbing, is that Christianity, with the rise of Islam, seems always to be in retreat. Christianity establishes itself maybe for hundreds of years. Islam comes along and it declines, or its Christians are pushed out. Once Islam comes, it never leaves. It doesn't leave. Think of Turkey. You've heard the name Ataturk, I assume. Ataturk was the great reformer of the Ottoman Empire, which was the Turkish Empire all through the Middle East. Around the year 1915 to 1920, there was a political revolution in Turkey, and Ataturk basically eliminated public expression of Islam in the old Ottoman Empire, which became the state of Turkey. Eliminated. 100 years later, there's been a resurgence of religious Islam within Turkey. You can't imagine that happening in France. That historic French Catholicism would arise again and drive out secular French culture. You can't imagine. The same thing in Britain. The same thing in Germany. So it's a sad commentary that in telling the story of Christianity, you have to tell a story of decline as well as growth, progress, and triumph. Very sobering.
I appreciate that reflection. Thank you for your candid reflection there. Very much appreciated. And sir, if I can ask sort of a part B to the same question, how would Christianity perhaps look different today if Islam had not been such a force? What are some of the things in ancient Christianity that are reshaped dramatically by Islam? How would Christianity today be different?
Well, I'm not sure Islam brought about a reshaping. What it did do was to change the character of those Christian communities that lived under Islam. That means in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, where you still have living Christian communities, or unless you did until quite recently. There, Christians learned to live as a subject people who did not control their own fate. In contrast to Christianity in the West, whether it be Roman Catholicism, or whether it be Christianity, Protestant Christianity in Northern Europe, there's a strong triumphalist strain in European Christianity, which probably was very harmful. One of the reasons why we had a French Revolution. That's one of the reasons why European Christianity has so militantly rejected its Christian traditions. Because Christianity became so identified with the state, with political power, with kings. And they controlled many things. For example, who would be elected pope? They controlled the education, the school system. So the triumphalism of political Christianity brought a lot of damage. And the Eastern Christians didn't have to deal with that. Not to say that they would have done any better. The story of Greece after the sort of the renewal of Greek Christianity in the 19th century is not a happy story. And the story of Christianity in the Eastern Europe is not a happy story on the terms of political Christianity. There's just too much comfort in the relation between political and religious authority. But I think in terms of the basic givenness of what historic Christianity was, that really wasn't changed by Islam. I mean, the understanding of the Eucharist, the role of the bishop, monasticism, those things were in the West and they were in the East in equal measure.
Professor Wilken, we're very, very grateful for your responses. If I can turn our discussion now to address Dr. Thompson, who's also with us. Dr. Thompson, we're so glad you can also spend some time with us and join us. Again, you're now teaching in the Asian context. You're teaching at Asia Lutheran Seminary in Hong Kong after a number of years of teaching in the States. As a scholar of early Christianity, who's spent many years teaching the history of Christianity, now both in the West and the East, what are some of the new questions that arise when one reads church history outside of a Western context? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me okay? I also began my ministry with 6 years in Central Africa, in Zambia. So I began and did some teaching there, church history already at that point. And so my eyes were awakened early on to the need to tell the story in a much larger context. At that time, concentrating on early Coptic Christianity, going into Sudan and Ethiopia, stories that Dr. Wilken tells very nicely in his story, in his book. And also, still would like to wish we had some sources to let us know what happened from Northern Africa. I have a hunch Christianity seeped across the Sahara during those days as well, at least to some extent, but obviously never got planted in a way that we can at least trace at this point. Dr. Wilken correctly pointed out about the triumphalist strain that we have in the West. I think any time you start studying world Christianity, that it really helps you reorient your own focus in a much less triumphalistic and more grounded way, I think. Much better balance between the church militant and the church triumphant, seeing both sides in Christianity as it played out in Africa and as it's played out in Asia, but doing it in a little more sober way and keeping our Western contribution a little more in check and a little bit more with there, but for the grace of God, we would have gone as well. We normally think of persecution, as ending in 325, and once you start reading the bigger story, you see that isn't true at all. One of the good books I'd recommend, by the way, on Eastern Christianity that came out more recently that Dr. Wilken may not have seen is by David Wilmshurst, and it's called The Martyred Church, and it's a story of the Church of the East in particular. And that was a very appropriate title about the history of that church right up until the day that it was printed and continues to be. One other thing that struck me very much, especially in the Asian context and with the early church in China, is how labels can change attitudes. When the early Tang Dynasty church was rediscovered by modern historians with the discovery of the so-called Nestorian stele in Xi'an early in the 1600s. Very soon after that, as the debate went back and forth about whether it was a Jesuit forgery or really an ancient thing, but very soon it was labeled as Nestorian because of that Syriac writing on the side. And really that just continued a pattern that took place in the Byzantine and the Western Church from almost the founding of the Church of the East, for not the best reasons, but almost as a convenient label to distinguish them from the Jacobite Christians and the other types of Christians. They started becoming labeled Nestorians, and to this day they can't shake that label, at least among historians. And we really have no evidence of Nestorian Christology in the texts, but even scholarly conferences still normally use that term, and as a result of that, Chinese Christians today have had very little interest in that early church.
Wow.
Church historians didn't either for quite a while, but now they're getting an interest. And but what was part of the history of their church in their country was kind of totally eliminated for most of them just because of that label.
Could I ask a question at this point?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Thompson, I completely agree with what you say. One of the problems, and I wonder if you have an answer for this, is that there is no adjective to be used with respect to the Church of the East. You have Byzantine, Latin, Armenian. Have you been able to come up with one? I dearly wanted one as I was writing this book, and I could not figure out it's so cumbersome.
Yes. Sorry, I have no easy solution. That was just discussed again at a conference about the Church of the East in China at the Hong Kong University in June. And even the Church of the East is not exactly well attested in early literature, but as you say, it's so cumbersome. In China, we more and more just go by calling it by its Chinese name, the Jingjiao, the illustrious church. But that even it has a different name during the Yuan dynasty than during the Tang dynasty, so that's not a cure-all either. But sorry, we really don't have a solution for that one. So I wanted to ask you about monasticism. As you go into the Church of the East, whether it's down into Ethiopia, wherever, monasticism's always there, and it increasingly was of interest to me to see how important monasticism was in the missionary process.
Right.
Now, often when we give the name to a famous missionary, St. Patrick or Halopen in China, I really don't think it's exactly the same as David Livingstone. This is usually the person who comes in to organize the church after some Christians are already there, and then make it spread it, if you will. But still, monasticism, we as Protestants, always feel little twinges about how to relate to the spirituality of monasticism. Can you explain for us how people who we think of as going off in the desert to pray end up being missionaries?
Well, first, to just build on your initial point, that wherever you go, whether you go to Sudan or Armenia or Iraq or Iran or Ireland or Asia Minor, there are always monasteries. Monasticism starts very early, establishes itself. I think the way in which they become missionaries is, as you say, it's not a matter of a lone monk heading out and preaching. What they do is they establish Christian communities in the midst of, quote unquote, an alien community. And what they present then is not so much a message, but they present a way of life. That people who have chosen a more radical form of Christian life. And of course, monasticism, we know from its long history, is infinitely malleable. It can be the lonely hermit in the desert of Egypt, but it can be a vibrant community in Northern Europe, in France, which is very much concerned about handing on the Christian cultural inheritance. And so monasticism then becomes a microcosm of the larger Christian world, trying to create not simply a community of individual believers, but to create a city. The most enduring metaphor for Christianity from the Bible on, starting with the Psalms and the book of Revelation, the final vision, and of course St. Augustine, is a city of God. It's an ordered community. And that was the way in which monasticism then presented itself. But it also did another thing, and I have really two, I think, for me, were very striking examples. One, the way in which a monk or the monks would teach the local people the Christian language. In Ireland, it was Latin. And in Kazakhstan, it was Syriac. And they would teach them the rudiments of the language by using the Psalms. And so the transmission of the faith requires a language, and it requires books. And in the Syriac Christian world, and in the Eastern world, that was Syriac. I remember being in India a few years ago and going into a church, and I wasn't surprised. I found what I thought I would. I found liturgical books in Syriac in Kerala. So there were just many dimensions. I think I'm going to say the classical or the Catholic way was seldom sending out missionaries as lone figures, but transplanting Christian communities, and the monks, of course, were the ones who could do that.
Thank you. I think what you're saying about multicultural, the multicultural world of Christianity really struck me. At this recent conference, we heard about a monastery that documents came out of on the extreme northwest edge of China. It may be part of Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan or something right now. But in that monastery, they had a bunch of papyri fragments that were found in vellum fragments. And I think there were in 8 different languages in this one monastery. You know, Old Sogdian and Persian and Syriac and Uyghur and Chinese. And you just imagine what those Church of the East monasteries must have been like along the Silk Road, and the kind of multicultural mix that they must have had there.
And that's the monks were the ones who could do the translating. This was what most impressed me about Arabic-speaking Christianity. When they first began to use Arabic rather than Syriac or Greek in the Middle East, it was places like Morsaba, not too far from Bethlehem, or Sinai, where the translations took place. So their contribution was really variable.
Okay, due to some of our technical difficulties, we have one student question that we would love if you could answer for us, and then continue the conversation among yourselves. We're enjoying hearing your conversation. So this one student question that we'd like to ask is, do you think it's possible to begin bridging the gap between the Eastern and Western churches? And I'll give it back to you.
I think they wanted you to answer that one, Dr. Wilken.
Well, you have certainly much more experience than I. Well, there's so many different forms of Christianity. Look, the first obligation of Western Christians has to be to the Orthodox. And that has to do because their histories were so interwoven. And there has been some advances over the last 50 or 75 years, but it's very, very slow because the Christians of Eastern Europe, whether it be Greek or Slavic, they have such bad memories of the way in which triumphalist Western Christianity has tried to push into territories that they consider their own. They remember, especially in Greece and the Balkans, they remember the Fourth Crusade, where crusaders supposedly going to Jerusalem to fight the Muslims wind up taking, sacking, and setting up a Western kingdom in Constantinople. So there's just so much that has to be overcome. I read somewhere recently, I think it was in the current number of First Things, a piece by David Hart, and he made the point that Pope Francis has been very forthcoming in terms of his relation to Eastern Christians, especially the Orthodox, and with the Patriarch of Constantinople. And he made the very interesting point, which I noticed the night that Pope Francis came out for the first time on the balcony in Rome. He did not call himself Pope. He called himself the Bishop of Rome. That's a profound ecumen, and he said it several times. That's a way of saying that I want you Christians in the East to realize that I am not interested in ruling over you. So that's as far as the Orthodox. There's just so much there, and it has not been helped, of course, by the history of modern Russian-speaking Christianity because of communism and now Putin. For the Christians in the East, I think that is the East of the East, there it's a matter of the Christians in the West have to work very hard just to educate Western Christians that they are part of us. They are part of our history. And to reach out and to help them, especially now in their great time of need. For example, there's a organization in England, maybe you know it, called the Barnabas Club or something. And they, for $3,000, a parish in the West can support a family, a refugee family, you know, Syrian Christians. But in terms of ecumenical gestures, I think that's so far from the mind of the Eastern Christian now, because survival is the name of the game. The Copts, for example. But I do think that, and since you've spent time in Africa and in Asia, I do think that the emergence of strong communities in these parts of the world will make a difference, because they have a kind of an empathy, and I speak from a distance here, with Christians outside the West that the Western Christian wouldn't normally have. But you really know more about this than I.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you've said. And interestingly enough, I think we're entering a new era. I think by now we probably have more Syriac-speaking Christians living outside the Middle East, in exile, if you will, in Europe, America, huge populations in Australia. Right. And it will be very interesting to see what happens with these communities, if they can, now that they are in a more loving environment, or not always loving, perhaps they're still often going to be looked at as outsiders, but a more stable environment, whether they can develop a little more openness and get over some of the history that they've experienced as well. There have been 3 or 4 international conferences in Salzburg in the last 15 years having to do with the Church of the East in Central Asia and China. And they grew out of Catholic ecumenical attempts to speak with Syriac churches. But what I was told by the people who started it, that they found out that the Syriac churches wouldn't talk to each other. It was hard to get them in the same room because they had all of this baggage. Mm-hmm. So then they decided to take a more historical approach and see if that could help round off some edges, and we ended up in this direction. Right. So it's not just us Westerners. Let me just say one more thing about that. Again, labels are all important, and I think what each of us does in our own lives should make a difference as well. It'll be up to each of you students, when you come across a Syriac Christian or a Coptic Christian, to take the time to get to know that person, to express some sort of Christian solidarity with that person, rather than just treat them like some strange, different sect, which is sometimes what we tend to do. In China, we have even a larger problem. You probably find it funny, Dr. Wilken, but knowing that I'm a Lutheran, that I spend the first hour of every new class in church history with my Chinese students trying to show them why Catholics are Christian. and that is because in the Chinese language, they have 2 separate words. So they use the word Christian the way we use the word Protestant. So if you go into a church with a cross on it up in China, you're either a Catholic or a Christian. But once again, those labels kind of are exclusionary. So in the minds of many of these people, they never do think of Catholics as really the same as us, having a Christian faith. So I always find it very important to try to spend some time showing them that these labels, I haven't been able to change the labels, but make sure when you say that word Catholic, you're thinking that this is someone who believes in the triune God, has the same rule of faith, the same, recites the Apostles' Creed, and believes in the same Savior as we do. And I think every one of those little things that we try to do is going to be a useful thing down the road.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that. I had an experience precisely of that sort. I was last week giving a couple of talks at Benedictine University in Naperville, Illinois, and I spoke informally to a number of classes, and some of these questions came up, and I think she was an Indian woman, young Indian woman, and she had been raised Catholic. Now maybe it was Hispanic, and she had become an evangelical, and her parents thought that the word Christian represented something different from what they were as Catholics. So she had to convince her parents that in becoming an evangelical, she's Christian, or she's the same as a Catholic. Yeah. So you write labels. But I want to ask, so are you Wisconsin Synod?
Yes.
Good. That's amazing. I mean, really amazing to me. I graduated from Cardiff Seminary in St. Louis.
Yes.
And so you went to the seminary in Wisconsin?
Yes, sir.
Oh, that's fabulous. I mean, I don't think the students appreciate how much that resonates to someone like myself.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, for you young students, nobody is trying to take you away from your beliefs. And your biblical beliefs in your local church, you have to make that decision. And as you study the history of Christianity and the different beliefs people have, it just makes you re-examine your own to see if you really do have what you think is the truth, and check that out in a very real way. But while you cling to those beliefs, that doesn't mean you have to kind of exclude everybody else around you as part of the kingdom of God. I still personally, in my denomination, think that there are reasons why things like communion and worship should be done with your own faith group. But that doesn't mean I'm not at all helpful to and encouraging the faith of others who are in other faith groups. And as you meet people in the Coptic Church and this Syriac Church, I'm constantly thanking God for their faith and for what their churches are doing under pressure in circumstances that I and my church have never had to face.
Good.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your resiliency through our technical difficulties. It seemed to have actually worked out pretty well on our end, at least. And we very much enjoyed the conversation. And thank you both for your valuable time.
Thank you. And
thank you.
Lovely chatting with you, Dr. Wilken.
My pleasure, too.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Okay. Have a wonderful day, both of you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.